It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday dinner. Mom passed the cheesecake, and Dad poured the wine. That's when they said it. The words hanging in the air, clear as daylight. "We wish your sister was our only child." My sister smirked, slicing into her cake as if she'd just won a grand prize. She didn't know it yet, but she'd already lost everything. My name is Claire Dalton. I'm 33 years old, and for most of those years, I've understood that my family operates on a set of unspoken rules. Sunday dinners were the main arena where these rules were enforced. They were held at my parents' house in Fairview Heights, a suburb so meticulously planned it felt like a movie set. The lawns were impossibly green, the mailboxes stood at perfect attention, and inside each home, families like mine played out their quiet, respectable dramas. This particular Sunday was no different. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of vanilla from a trio of scented candles and the savory aroma of my mother's roast chicken. The long mahogany table was covered with a crisp white linen tablecloth, ironed to perfection. My mother, Helen, believed that a proper table setting could solve most of life's problems. Polished silverware gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, and wine glasses stood ready, their bowls empty and waiting. It was a portrait of middle-class tranquility, a carefully constructed illusion I had long since learned to see through. I sat opposite my sister, Melanie, at 29. She still possessed the kind of effortless, doe-eyed charm that had always made people want to take care of her. She was wearing a new silk blouse, its pearlescent sheen catching the light. I knew for a fact she hadn't worked a day in 6 months. Not since she'd been let go from her marketing job under circumstances that were always vaguely described as a restructuring. She was, in my parents' preferred narrative, a beautiful, creative soul who was simply having a streak of bad luck, a fallen angel who just needed her wings mended. In reality, she was living off a steady allowance from them, her rent paid, her car insurance covered, her life subsidized by their bottomless well of indulgence. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, carving the chicken with practiced precision. He was a man of few words, his silence often mistaken for wisdom. He'd spent 40 years in insurance, a profession that had taught him to assess risk and value, a skill that, I'd come to realize, he applied to his own children. "Claire, dear, how was your week?" my mother asked, her voice as smooth and pleasant as the Chardonnay she was pouring into Melanie's glass before mine. "It was good. Mom, actually, it was great." I waited for her to meet my eyes, but her focus remained on ensuring Melanie's glass was filled to the perfect level. I got the promotion. Silence, not a hostile silence, but a weighted one, the kind that follows an unexpected announcement at a board meeting. My father paused his carving, the knife hovering over the bird. Melanie took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes unreadable. I pushed on, my voice a little too bright in the quiet room. "They're making me a senior project manager for the new fiscal quarter. It's a big step up. More responsibility, leading my own team. I had worked 12-hour days for this. I had sacrificed weekends, powered through migraines, and navigated the treacherous politics of my financial firm with a cold, clear-eyed focus. I had earned this. It was a tangible victory, a solid, undeniable achievement. My mother finally turned her gaze to me, a tight, polite smile on her lips. Then, her eyes flickered over to Melanie, her expression softening into a familiar look of pity and protective love. "Well, isn't that nice, dear?" she said, her tone implying it was merely nice, like a new brand of hand soap. She then looked directly at my sister, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, comforting murmur. "You see? Your sister proves it. You don't need a lot of money or a fancy title to be happy." The words landed like tiny, sharp stones. I felt the familiar clenching in my gut, the heat rising in my chest. She had done it again. With a single sentence, she had masterfully reframed my success. It was no longer an achievement to be celebrated. It was a character flaw, an example of a shallow, materialistic life that her precious, artistic Melanie was too pure to desire. My victory had been twisted into a backhanded compliment, a tool to soothe my sister's ego. I swallowed the bitter retort that rose in my throat. I had learned long ago that arguing was pointless. It would only lead to me being labeled as difficult or ungrateful, so I just smiled. A thin, brittle thing that didn't reach my eyes. You're right, Mom. Happiness is what's important. My father resumed his carving, the tension seemingly resolved. The conversation drifted to safer topics, the neighbor's gaudy new garden gnome, the rising price of gas, a documentary Melanie had watched about the plight of artisanal cheesemakers in Vermont. I ate my chicken and garlic mashed potatoes, each bite tasting of ash. I watched as my parents hung on Melanie's every word, laughing at her bland observations as if they were pearls of comedic genius. I watched as she soaked up their attention. The rightful heir to a throne I had never been allowed to approach. I wasn't a participant in this family dinner. I was an audience member, a silent observer at a play I'd seen 1,000 times before. Finally, the plates were cleared, and my mother brought out the dessert, a New York-style cheesecake with a glistening cherry topping. It was my father's favorite. She cut 4 perfect slices, placing the largest one in front of Melanie. As my father poured the last of the wine, a deep, expensive-looking Cabernet he'd been saving, he sighed contentedly. He swirled the wine in his glass, looked at Melanie with an expression of profound, uncomplicated adoration, and then glanced at me, his eyes holding a cool, appraising distance. "You know, Helen," he said, his voice resonating in the quiet room. "Sometimes I look at our family, at our beautiful Melanie." He paused, letting the weight of his words gather, "and I think, we wish your sister was our only child." The air left my lungs. The vanilla scent of the candles suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like hammer blows. He had said it. He had finally said the quiet part out loud. All the years of subtle preferences, of tilted scales and uneven affection, had been distilled into one brutally honest sentence. I looked at my mother, expecting, hoping for, some flicker of protest, a defense of her firstborn, but she just offered a sad, resigned little smile, as if agreeing with a painful but undeniable truth. Then, I looked at Melanie. A slow, triumphant smirk was spreading across her face. She picked up her fork, the silver glinting, and cut a perfect, precise bite of her cheesecake. She looked directly at me, her eyes shining with victory. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness, "maybe it's not too late to trade her in." Something inside me snapped, not with a loud, violent crack, but with a quiet, clean break. The carefully constructed dam of composure I had spent a lifetime building was gone. In its place was a chilling, absolute calm. I placed my fork and knife down on my plate, the silver making a soft clink against the porcelain. I folded my linen napkin and set it beside my plate. I pushed my chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the polished hardwood floor unnaturally loud in the silence. I stood up. I didn't say a word. There were no words left to say. They had said them all. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my steps even and measured. I could feel their eyes on my back. As I reached the front door, my hand on the cold brass knob, I heard my mother's voice, not angry or concerned, but weary and annoyed. "For heaven's sake, Claire," she called out, "don't be so dramatic." That was it. That was the final piece. The dismissal of my pain as melodrama. The final confirmation that my feelings were an inconvenience to their perfect family portrait. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool autumn night. The air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere I had just left. As I walked to my car, the key fob cool in my palm, a decision formed in my mind. It wasn't born of hot, impulsive anger, but of a cold, clear, and profound certainty. They wished for a family with one daughter. They had made their choice, stated their preference as plainly as ordering from a menu. Fine, if they wanted to lose me, I would grant their wish. I would erase myself from their lives. But I wouldn't just disappear. I would orchestrate it. I would make my absence a consequence, a reckoning. I would vanish in a way they would never, ever forget. The drive back to my apartment downtown was a blur of streetlights and silent fury. The car, a sensible sedan I'd bought with my own money, felt less like a vehicle and more like a decompression chamber, the only space where the scream I'd swallowed could finally echo in my head. But it wasn't just the events of one dinner I was replaying, it was my entire life, viewed through a new, brutally clear lens. My father's words hadn't created the rift, they had only illuminated the chasm that had always been there. This chasm was built on a foundation of carefully curated family mythology. In the Dalton family lore, there were 2 daughters, each cast in a role from birth. Melanie was the protagonist. She was the sensitive, free-spirited artist, the pretty one, the charmer. She was the walking, talking embodiment of sunshine and spontaneous joy. Her feelings were vast and important. Her whims were creative impulses, and her failures were never her fault. They were the tragic byproduct of a world too harsh for her delicate soul. Everyone loved Melanie. It was a fact, repeated as often as the Pledge of Allegiance. And then there was me. I was the supporting character, the foil. I was the smart one. A label that was always delivered with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh, as if it were a consolation prize for a terminal lack of charm. I was dependable, capable, and as a result, cold. My self-sufficiency wasn't seen as a strength, but as a strange, unfeminine detachment. My ambitions were not celebrated. They were treated as a peculiar, joyless obsession. I was the reliable bedrock upon which the grand dramatic opera of Melanie's life could be staged. This myth-making machine was running before I could even read. I remember a parent-teacher conference in 3rd grade. My report card was a perfect wall of A's. My teacher, Mrs. Gable, praised my discipline and vocabulary. My mother's response, I would later learn, was to ask, "But is she happy? She's always so serious." Meanwhile, that same year, Melanie failed a spelling test and cried so theatrically that her teacher let her retake it. That story became a beloved family anecdote, retold at holidays to illustrate Melanie's irresistible charm. No one ever mentioned that she still misspelled miracle. The centerpiece of the Melanie myth, the crown jewel of her legend, was a small plastic trophy from a 3rd grade dance recital. It was for most enthusiastic performer in a non-competitive showcase, the equivalent of a participation award. In our house, it was treated like an Oscar. It sat on the center of the living room mantelpiece, its cheap gold plating catching the light, forever enshrined as proof of Melanie's innate, starlight quality. My mother would dust it reverently, and when guests came over, she would launch into the epic tale of Melanie's performance, how the spotlight just seemed to find her, how she had a natural grace the other little girls lacked. My own award certificates for the regional science fair, a plaque for the state debate championship, the thick, embossed letter offering me a full academic scholarship to college were glanced at, met with a tepid, "That's nice, dear," and then stored in a filing cabinet in the basement, filed under C for Claire. The financial disparity was the most tangible manifestation of this divide. My scholarship covered tuition, but I worked for everything else. I spent my college years smelling of burnt coffee and fried onions from my job at a 24-hour diner. I remember the bone-deep exhaustion of studying for a calculus final after a 10-hour shift, my textbooks stained with grease spots. During those years, Melanie was finding herself. This journey of self-discovery was apparently best conducted in Europe, funded entirely by my parents. I'd receive postcards from Rome and Barcelona, her loopy handwriting detailing some handsome artist she'd met, or a life-changing croissant she'd eaten. The year I was saving every penny for a down payment on a used car. My parents bought her a brand new convertible for her 21st birthday. The reason, she just looked so sad. We wanted to see her smile. The day I made the final payment on my student loans was a monumental achievement for me. It was 6 years of diligent, aggressive payments, of living frugally and sacrificing luxuries. I had freed myself from a significant financial burden entirely on my own. I told my mother over the phone, expecting, foolishly, a word of congratulations. Instead, there was a pause, and then she sighed. her voice laced with that familiar, tragic pity she reserved for anyone who wasn't Melanie. "Oh, Claire," she said. "That's good. I'm just so glad your sister will never have to struggle like you did." Once again, my discipline was not a virtue, it was a hardship. My accomplishment was merely a reminder of a burden her preferred daughter would never have to bear. Nowhere was this clearer than with our respective homes. At 28, after years of saving, I bought my first apartment. It was a small one-bedroom in a decent building, but it was mine. The pride I felt was immense. I painted the walls myself, carefully selected each piece of furniture, and threw a small housewarming party. I invited my parents a month in advance, the week of. They called to cancel. My father had to rest up for a golf game, and my mother was feeling a headache coming on. They never rescheduled. They never saw the home I had built for myself. 2 years later, Melanie decided to move out of their house. She rented a dingy, railroad-style apartment in a questionable neighborhood. The paint was peeling, the floors creaked, and the kitchen was a relic from the 1970s. My parents were there every weekend. They took her shopping for curtains. My father patched the drywall, and my mother filled her fridge with organic groceries. Their grand gesture was buying and installing a brand-new, top-of-the-line dishwasher. I discovered this when I stopped by one Saturday to find my father on his back, sliding the machine into place. When I asked why, my mother looked at me as if I were insane. "Well, she can't be expected to wash all her dishes by hand," she said, her voice full of genuine concern. "The poor thing needs to be taken care of." I looked around the dilapidated apartment, then thought of my own, which had no dishwasher. The message was screaming at me. My independence was an inconvenience, my competence a reason to be ignored. Melanie's helplessness was an invitation, a glorious opportunity for them to shower her with the love and support I was never offered because I never asked. It was around that time that I started the ledger. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more of a morbid curiosity. I created a password-protected document on my laptop titled Accounting. In it, I began to log the discrepancies, every dismissive comment, every forgotten achievement of mine juxtaposed with an exaggerated celebration of Melanie's mediocrity. Every dollar they spent on her, the car, the rent, the investment in her fleeting pottery business was noted. It was a cold, emotionless chronicle of favoritism. It became my own private, bitter scripture, a way of proving to myself that I wasn't imagining it, that the injustice was real and quantifiable. It was a form of emotional accounting, balancing the books on a family that was emotionally bankrupt. I thought the ledger had numbed me. I thought that by documenting the unfairness, by reducing it to data points, I had somehow risen above the pain. I believed I had accepted my role, that I had grown used to being the less-loved daughter. I was wrong. That Sunday dinner proved how wrong I was. As my father's words echoed in the vanilla-scented air, I realized the truth. It was so much simpler and so much more horrifying than I had ever allowed myself to believe. The ledger documented symptoms, not the disease. The disease wasn't favoritism. It wasn't that they loved Melanie more. It was that they resented me. They resented my A's, my scholarship, my career, my apartment, my ability to pay my own bills. They resented every single thing that made me not need them. Their love was a lifeline, and they only knew how to give it to someone who was drowning. I had stubbornly insisted on learning how to swim. My independence wasn't just an afterthought, it was a betrayal. It robbed them of their purpose as saviors and caretakers. Melanie, in her perpetual state of curated crisis, allowed them to feel needed, to feel important, to feel like parents. I, by taking care of myself, had made them obsolete. They didn't just wish Melanie was their only child. They hated me because I had proven that I could live as one. I don't remember the specifics of the drive, only the feeling of the steering wheel vibrating under my white-knuckled grip. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It was a deep, internal tremor that started in my chest and radiated out to my fingertips, a physical manifestation of the tectonic shift that had just occurred in my soul. Back in my apartment, the familiar silence that I usually cherished as a peaceful sanctuary now felt vast and menacing. The city skyline, visible from my 14th floor window, was a glittering, indifferent expanse. I was an island, a population of one, and the bridges to my past had just been burned to the ground. I didn't turn on the television or put on music. I just stood in the middle of my living room, the room I was so proud of, with its clean lines and carefully chosen art, and felt utterly, completely unmoored. The anger was a wild, roaring fire, but beneath it was the deep, Arctic cold of grief. I was mourning a family I realized I had never truly had. The illusion, the myth I'd both hated and clung to, was dead. My default coping mechanism, the one I had honed over a lifetime of emotional neglect, was work. Work was logical. It had rules. Effort produced results. I retreated to my small home office, sank into my ergonomic chair, and powered on my laptop. The familiar glow of the screen was a comfort. I could lose myself in spreadsheets and data points, in tasks with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. It was a world where I had value, where my competence was an asset, not a personality flaw. As my inbox loaded, a new message popped to the top, its subject line in bold, commanding attention, Confidential Executive Restructuring Initiative. I clicked it open. It was from the firm's chief financial officer, a man I respected immensely. The email was concise and formal. A major corporate restructuring was underway, involving the acquisition of several smaller companies and the divestiture of non-performing assets. My recent promotion, he wrote, made me the ideal candidate to lead a critical preliminary project, a comprehensive internal audit of all third-party contractors and subsidiary firms slated for integration. It was a high-stakes, high-visibility assignment, a vote of confidence, a testament to the very career my mother had just dismissed as a sad substitute for happiness. I downloaded the attached project files, a mountain of encrypted documents. The list of entities to be audited was long, mostly names I didn't recognize: logistics companies, software developers, consulting groups. I started creating a project plan, my mind gratefully latching onto the familiar structure of the task, the tremors in my hands finally starting to subside as I mapped out timelines and deliverables. It was almost 3 a.m. when I saw the name. I was deep into the financials of a mid-sized marketing agency called Marvine Media, a contractor whose account was flagged for inconsistent payment cycles. I was scrolling through a dense PDF of their paid invoices for the last fiscal year, my eyes bleary from the screen's glare. And then, there it was, a name that leaped off the page and seemed to electrocute my senses: Payee Melanie Dalton. I sat bolt upright, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. It couldn't be. Marvine Media was the company that had let her go 6 months ago. Why would they still be paying her? I zoomed in on the document. It was an invoice for $10,000. The description line was maddeningly vague. For strategic consulting fees. Beneath it was a signature, a loopy, stylized M, I would recognize anywhere. It was my sister's. The payment was dated 2 months after her employment had been terminated. My auditor's brain, cold and analytical, took over. This was wrong. This was a bright red flag. Strategic consulting fees are paid to high-level experts, not to junior account coordinators who, according to family lore, had been a victim of corporate downsizing. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I exited the invoice file and dove into Marvine's accounts payable ledger, cross-referencing payment codes and vendor IDs. I found not one, but 3 such payments made to Melanie over a 4-month period, all under the same consulting guise. The total was $30,000. It was a significant sum, but cleverly broken up into chunks small enough to avoid triggering an automatic high-level review. Something was deeply rotten here, driven by a grim, burgeoning suspicion. I pulled the corresponding logs for Marvine's legitimate suppliers during that same period. The picture that emerged was stark. While my unemployed sister was receiving tens of thousands of dollars for phantom consulting work, the company's actual vendors, printers, photographers, freelance writers had invoices that were 90 days or more past due. Marvine Media was stiffing its suppliers while making suspicious, off-the-books payments to a former employee. Then I found the smoking gun. It was a series of smaller invoices, all for a shell company I'd never heard of, Creative Edge Solutions, LLC. The invoices were for digital design services, but they lacked purchase order numbers and detailed breakdowns of work. They were ghost invoices, and at the bottom of each one, in the space for managerial approval, was the same signature, Melanie's. She had been signing off on fake invoices. She had been helping someone or herself defraud the company. The entire scheme was amateurish but insidious. It was designed to bleed the company slowly, to siphon funds in a way that looked like the cost of doing business until you started pulling on the threads, and I was holding all of them. My mind was a maelstrom of shock, disgust, and a dark rising sense of something else leverage. I methodically began to save everything. I created a new, password-protected external hard drive, one I kept in my fireproof safe. I downloaded every single piece of evidence, the invoices with Melanie's signature, the payment records from the bank, the logs of overdue payments to legitimate vendors, the corporate registration for the shell company. I created a timeline, a clear, damning narrative of fraud. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was an auditor who had uncovered a crime. I leaned back in my chair, the first light of dawn beginning to streak the sky. The evidence sat on the drive, a ticking bomb. I stared at it, my mind blank. What was I going to do? Exposing this would destroy her. It would lead to a corporate investigation, legal action, possibly criminal charges. It would bring ruin and public shame upon my family. Was that what I wanted? Did I have that kind of cruelty in me? The raw animal part of me screamed yes. The part that had been meticulously trained in ethics and professionalism was in turmoil. I didn't know what I was going to do. I truly didn't. And then, my phone buzzed on the desk beside me, the screen lighting up the dark room. It was a text message from my mother. Melanie is so worried about making rent this month. Claire, the landlord, isn't very understanding. You're doing so well. Could you please help your sister out? She needs you. I stared at the message, reading it over and over again, the audacity, the sheer, galactic-scale blindness of it. Less than 12 hours after my father had wished me out of existence, here was my mother, with no apology, no acknowledgement of the wound, simply asking me to use the fruits of my success, the very success they scorned, to subsidize the lifestyle of the daughter they preferred, to clean up a mess. Though she had no idea of its true scale, they were asking me to fund the life of the person who had just smirked as my heart was being carved out. The conflict within me vanished, replaced by a clarity so pure and so cold it felt like ice forming in my veins. My thumbs hovered over the screen. I began to type a reply. A torrent of rage and truth. She's not worried about rent. She's a thief. You erased me from your family and now you want my money? You have no idea what she's done. I typed it all out, my fingers trembling again, but this time with rage, not pain. I read the message back, a declaration of war. It felt good. It felt justified. And then, slowly, deliberately, I deleted it, letter by letter, until the message box was empty again. A scream was what they would expect from me, a dramatic confrontation. It was the role they had written for me, but I was done playing my part. I did not help. I put the phone down, face down on the desk. I turned back to the files on my screen. I would not be the agent of her destruction, not directly. I would simply be an observer. I would watch, and I would wait. The breaking point had passed. This was the beginning of the reckoning. The month that followed the dinner was a study in compartmentalization. By day, I was the newly promoted senior project manager, leading meetings with crisp efficiency, my voice steady, my analyses sharp. I managed timelines, delegated tasks, and earned the quiet respect of my team. I was the very picture of corporate competence. But by night, I descended into the digital rabbit hole of Marvin Media. My apartment, once a refuge from the world, became a command center, fueled by black coffee and a cold, simmering rage. I dedicated myself to the secret audit, the one that wasn't on any official project plan. Work, in its purest form, is a hunt for truth in a forest of data, and I was a very, very good hunter. The initial discovery of Melanie's phantom consulting fees was just the trailhead. I spent weeks, then a month, meticulously mapping the entire rotten ecosystem of her fraud. It was far more extensive than I had initially thought. I moved beyond the company's internal servers, using my knowledge of forensic accounting to trace the money's path out in the real world. I cross-referenced IP addresses from email metadata, looked up corporate registration records, and pieced together a timeline that was as damning as it was pathetic. The trail led me to a man named Julian Croft. I remembered him vaguely from a disastrous Christmas dinner a few years back, Melanie's then-boyfriend. A slick, fast-talking junior stockbroker with expensive shoes and an air of predatory charm. My father had been impressed by him. I had found him repulsive. The shell company, Creative Edge Solutions LLC, was registered to a PEO box, but the incorporation documents listed a single director. A quick search of public records linked the director's name to a holding company that was, after 3 more layers of corporate misdirection, owned by Julian. The picture snapped into focus with nauseating clarity. This wasn't Melanie's scheme. She wasn't the architect. She was the tool. Julian had used her position inside Marvin Media, and her complete lack of a moral compass, to launder money. He would have his shell company bill Marvin for non-existent services, and Melanie, his girlfriend on the inside, would approve the invoices. The money would flow from Marvin to the shell, and from there, who knew where. It was a classic, grubby little scheme, and Melanie had been his willing accomplice, likely for a pathetic cut of the profits and whatever affection he threw her way. The fraud hadn't been for a few months. It had stretched back 18 months. A slow, steady drain on the company's resources. It was a testament to her mediocrity that she had managed to get away with it for so long. No one ever suspected the charming, slightly incompetent girl in marketing of being capable of anything so deliberate. I compiled everything into a single, devastating file, a digital dossier of her downfall. It contained scanned invoices with her forged signatures, bank transaction records, screenshots of email chains, a detailed flowchart showing the money moving from Marvin to Julian's Shell Corporation. It was an open and shut case. I held my sister's entire future in my hands. The obvious course of action was to include my findings in the official audit report. It was my fiduciary duty, but I held back. Submitting that report would mean putting my name on the accusation. I would be Claire Dalton, the vindictive sister who destroyed her own family. It would be messy, emotional. It would give them a narrative to cling to, a way to frame me as the villain. I could already hear my mother's tearful accusation. "You were always so jealous of her." No, my revenge would not be a messy, emotional outburst. It would be as clean and impersonal as a line item on a balance sheet. I bought a new USB drive, a tiny sliver of black metal. I transferred the entire dossier onto it, encrypting the file. The system prompted me for a password. Without hesitation, I typed in my mother's birthday, 0512, the date she brought life into the world, now serving as the key to a cage. The irony was a cold, satisfying knot in my stomach. I dropped the drive into the small fireproof safe in my closet, next to my birth certificate and the deed to my apartment, a hidden ledger of my own. A week later, I was in the main boardroom for a preliminary restructuring meeting. It was a high-level briefing with the suite. I presented my initial findings on the contractor audits, sticking to the official script identifying workflow inefficiencies and potential cost-saving measures. I was calm, professional, my voice even. At the end of my presentation, the CFO, Mr. Harrison, a sharp man who missed nothing, looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Excellent work, Claire. Thorough. As always. Before we move on, is there anything else? Any irregularities or potential liabilities we should be concerned about?" The entire room was looking at me. I could feel the weight of their attention. I thought of the USB drive sitting in my closet. I thought of Melanie's smiling, smug face at the dinner table. I let a small professional smile touch my own lips. Nothing that requires immediate action. "Sir," I said, my voice smooth as glass, "but I'm still in the data gathering phase. I have a feeling there will be—" It was the perfect corporate answer, vague yet intriguing, promising due diligence while hinting at something more. It was the truth, but a truth only I understood. Mr. Harrison nodded, satisfied, and the meeting moved on. I felt a surge of power, so potent it was almost dizzying. I was in complete control. That night, my real work began. I went to a public library in a distant neighborhood, a place I'd never been before, and used a public computer. I created a new, anonymous email address through a secure, encrypted service based in Switzerland. The username was meaningless, a jumble of letters and numbers. This email address would have no connection to Claire Dalton. It would be a ghost in the machine. My first email was a masterpiece of surgical precision. It was addressed to the general inbox of my company's legal department. Subject question regarding vendor Marvine Media. The body of the email was just 2 sentences. To whom it may concern, it may be beneficial to review all invoices submitted by Creative Edge Solutions LLC in the last 24 months, cross-referencing the approval signatures on those invoices with Marvine Media's employee records from the same period might yield interesting results. There was no name, no sign-off, just a single, sterile breadcrumb. I hit send and watched it disappear into the ether. Then I meticulously cleared the computer's cache and browsing history and walked out of the library, melting back into the anonymity of the city. I waited a week, then, from a different library, I sent a second email, this time to the head of accounts payable, CCing the legal department's general address. Subject follow-up, Marvine Media accounts. Further to the issue of questionable invoices, a review of Marvine Media's payment history to legitimate, long-term vendors may also be warranted. Significant payment delays seem to coincide with periods of high-volume invoicing from the aforementioned shell corporation. Another breadcrumb, another piece of the puzzle dropped into the system. I wasn't telling them what happened. I was just telling them where to look. I was letting their own competent professional auditors and lawyers become the instruments of my revenge. They would follow the trail because it was their job to do so. They would uncover the fraud and feel the thrill of discovery, never knowing the path had been laid for them. I wasn't a whistleblower. I wasn't a vengeful sister filing a report. I was merely an administrator of consequence. For years, I had watched my family operate in a world devoid of accountability, where love was misallocated and merit was ignored. Now, I was introducing a new variable into their ecosystem cause and effect. I wasn't directly accusing anyone. I was just pulling back the curtain and letting the harsh, unforgiving light of reality do the rest. While the seeds I had planted in my company's legal department were slowly germinating in the dark. My family was busy staging a brand new act in their long-running theatrical production. Melanie, oblivious to the storm gathering just over the horizon, decided it was time for her grand debut as an entrepreneur. Her announcement came, as most things in her life did, via a carefully curated Instagram post. The photo was a soft-focus masterpiece of self-congratulation Melanie, sitting in a chic cafe she couldn't afford, smiling wistfully at a brand-new leather-bound journal. The caption was a breathless monologue of hashtags and hollow inspiration. So excited to finally announce my next chapter. After months of soul-searching, I'm launching my very own brand, Aura by Mel, a bespoke lifestyle consultancy for the modern creative. It's been a dream for so long, and I'm so incredibly grateful for the support of my amazing family, who have always believed in me. They've provided the seed investment to make this a reality. Entrepreneur, boss, babe family. First manifesting dreams, Aura by Mel. I read the post on my phone during a 10-minute coffee break. The bitter taste of my black Americano a perfect match for the bile rising in my throat. Bespoke lifestyle consultancy. It was a meaningless string of buzzwords, a flimsy cover for her next grift, but the truly nauseating part was the seed investment. I knew exactly what that meant. My mother confirmed it a few days later in a brief, stilted phone call. Her voice was giddy, bubbling with a pride I had never heard directed at me. "Isn't it wonderful? Claire, Your sister is finally coming into her own. Your father and I decided to give her a little push. We want her to have the chance you had, to build something for herself." "How much of a push?" I asked, my voice flat. There was a slight hesitation. $60,000, she said, then rushed on as if to preempt any judgment. "It's from our retirement savings, but it's an investment in her future. She has so many wonderful ideas." $60,000. They had liquidated a substantial portion of their future security, the money they had carefully saved over 40 years, and handed it to a fraudster to fund a fantasy. They were pouring their life savings into a leaking bucket, and they were calling it an investment. I knew where that money was really going. It wouldn't be spent on business licenses or website development. It would be funneled to Julian, or used to pay for Melanie's overpriced apartment and designer clothes, vanishing into the same black hole that had consumed every opportunity she'd ever been given. The sheer, tragic blindness of it was staggering. I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard weight of my resolve. They had made their bet. It was time to let the wheel spin. My anonymous emails had started a slow-moving internal investigation, but corporate entities are cautious beasts. They move with deliberate, bureaucratic slowness, strangled by red tape and a desire to avoid liability. I needed to accelerate the timeline. I needed to move the story from the shadows of internal review into the light of public scrutiny. Once again, I found myself in a library, this time on the other side of the city. The target was different, not our legal department, but the press. I didn't want a major newspaper that would demand high-level sources. I wanted someone small, hungry, a local financial reporter looking to make a name for themselves. I found my mark in a journalist named Marcus Thorne, who wrote for a local online business journal. His articles were well-researched and had a slightly cynical, underdog edge. He was perfect. From my untraceable email account, I composed a new message. It was a work of art, if I did say so myself. I presented myself as a disgruntled former employee of Marvin Media, a person with a conscience who couldn't stay silent any longer. Subject: a story at Marvin Media. Mr. Thorne, I'm writing to you anonymously for fear of professional reprisal. I believe your readers would be interested in the financial situation at a local agency, Marvin Media, for over a year. The company has been chronically late paying its freelance creatives and small business suppliers, causing significant hardship for many. Yet, during this same period, records will show that the company has made regular, substantial payments to a shell corporation, Creative Edge Solutions, LLC, for vaguely defined services. Furthermore, these payments appear to have been approved by a junior-level employee, a Ms. Melanie Dalton, who was also receiving unusual consulting fees after her employment was terminated. It seems a strange allocation of resources for a company struggling to pay its legitimate bills. Perhaps it's just poor management, or perhaps it's something more. A journalist with your skills could likely uncover the truth by looking at public and corporation records and cross-referencing them with Marvin's supplier payment history. I hope you will. I attached a single, heavily redacted document, an invoice from Creative Edge Solutions, with just enough information visible to prove its authenticity, but not enough to trace it back to my audit files. I hit send. I had just lit a fuse. It took a week. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a quarterly budget projection, when a ripple of chatter started to spread through the office. A link was being shared on the internal chat. I clicked it. The headline, stark in black and white, made my pulse quicken. Local agency Marvin Media faces allegations of financial mismanagement, possible fraud. Marcus Thorne had done his job beautifully. The article was a careful, professional piece of investigative journalism. It detailed the struggles of unpaid local vendors, quoted anonymous sources from within Marvin, and most importantly, it connected the dots between the shell company and the unusual payments. It didn't mention Melanie by name, referring only to a former junior account coordinator, but the trail was now public. I closed the browser tab, my face a perfect mask of calm neutrality. I listened as my colleagues gossiped, Speculating on what it could mean for our company's acquisition plans. I offered no opinion, just a thoughtful hum. Inside, a cold, triumphant fire was burning. The most gratifying part of the day came that evening. I was scrolling through Twitter when a new tweet from Melanie appeared. She had posted a link to an article about the psychology of jealousy. Her accompanying text was a masterclass in deluded arrogance. It's so sad when you're finally building your dream and small, unhappy people try to tear you down. Some people just can't stand to see others succeed. Keep shining anyway. Haters gonna hate? Hate unbothered. I actually laughed out loud. A real, genuine laugh. The sound was foreign in the quiet of my apartment. She had no idea. She was standing in the middle of a collapsing building, admiring the new paint job, and blaming the tremor on jealousy. Her narcissism was so profound, so all-encompassing, that it had rendered her completely blind to the reality of her situation. She couldn't conceive of a world where her actions had consequences. That night, I began the final phase of my preparations. I took a screenshot of her tweet. I saved the URL of the news article. I created a new folder within my secret dossier, titling it Public Record. Every day from then on, I would add to it every self-pitying Instagram story, every arrogant tweet, every clueless Facebook post would be meticulously documented and preserved. I was no longer just an auditor. I was a curator. I was collecting and arranging the props for the final act of her tragedy. She thought she was the star of her own success story. She had no idea that I was the director, and that the countdown to the final curtain had already begun. The spark I had tossed into the public domain caught fire faster than I could have ever anticipated. Marcus Thorne's article acted as chum in the water, and soon, larger sharks began to circle. Within days, the city's main newspaper picked up the story, dedicating more resources and experienced reporters to digging into Marvin Media's finances. They unearthed the Shell Corporation's connection to Julian Croft, whose name had already been associated with a few shady investment schemes, and then they found the initials. It was buried deep in an expense report. They managed to leak a sign-off on a suspicious payment, not with a full signature, but with a simple, hastily scrawled M.D. The press ran with it. The story was no longer about abstract corporate mismanagement. It now had a human element, a mysterious figure at its center. Inside my own company, the mood shifted from gossip to serious damage control. The planned acquisition of Marvin was put on indefinite hold, and our internal investigation, which had been moving at a glacial pace, was suddenly supercharged. The walls were closing in, and they were closing in fast. When the Economic Crimes Unit officially announced their investigation into Marvin Media, it was the lead story on the evening news. The dry corporate fallout had morphed into a full-blown criminal case. That was when my phone rang. I saw Melanie's name flash on the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, just to feel the vibration of her panic in my hand. Claire. Her voice was a ragged, terrified whisper, stripped of all its usual melodic charm. It was the voice of a cornered animal. Claire, you have to help me. Help you with what? Melanie, I asked, my tone perfectly level, as if she were asking for help with a flat tire. The police. They called me. They want me to come in for questioning. They're talking about fraud, about Julian. They keep talking about M.D. They think it's me. A sob tore through her voice. I didn't do anything. It was all Julian. You know I'm not smart enough for this stuff. Please, you work in finance. You can explain it to them. You have to help me. I listened to her hysterical pleading, the pathetic denial, the desperate attempt to play her favorite role, the innocent, helpless victim. For a moment, I felt nothing at all, just a profound, hollow emptiness. Then, I remembered my father's face, beaming with adoration as he looked at her across the dinner table. I remembered her smirk. I don't think I'm the one you should be calling, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice water. What? What are you talking about? There's no one else. That's not true. I corrected her. Dad once said they wished you were their only child. They think you're a star. Melanie, I'm sure they'll know how to save you. I hung up before she could respond, the silence in my apartment ringing with the ghost of her frantic sobs. I did not feel a sliver of remorse. I felt only the clean, satisfying click of a lock falling into place. 2 days later, my mother called. She was weeping so hard I could barely understand her. The bank had frozen Melanie's accounts, citing the ongoing criminal investigation. The $60,000 seed investment was now locked away, a piece of evidence in a state prosecution file. The lifeline had been cut. That evening, they appeared at my door. I knew they would. I saw them on the lobby security camera, my father, his face a mask of thunderous rage, and my mother, her features puffy and ravaged from crying. I buzzed them in and waited, my back straight, my hands clasped calmly behind me. My father started shouting the moment I opened the door. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice shaking with a fury I had never seen from him. He stormed into my apartment as if he owned it, my mother trailing behind him like a ghost. "This is you. It has to be. This never would have happened if you hadn't been so jealous, so determined to ruin her." My mother joined in, her voice a high-pitched wail. "Her life is over. They're treating her like a criminal. How could you do this to your own sister? Claire, how could you be so cruel?" For my entire life, this was the moment I had dreaded being engulfed by the storm of their raw, unfiltered emotion, being blamed, being cast as the villain. But standing there, in my own home, a space I had earned and paid for, I felt no fear. I felt a strange, detached calm. "Please, come in," I said, my voice so quiet it seemed to stop their shouting. I gestured towards my living room. Confused by my lack of reaction, they followed, their anger momentarily deflated. On the coffee table, I had arranged a small stack of papers. They were printouts of every major news article about the Marvin Media case. Starting with Marcus Thorne's initial piece, I had used a highlighter, marking the relevant passages, the references to unpaid vendors, the explanation of the Shell Corporation, the discovery of the MD, initials. I didn't sit. I stood before them like I was delivering a presentation. "You're asking me what I did," I began, my voice devoid of accusation or anger. It was the voice I used in the boardroom. "This is what happened. A reporter started asking questions. Other reporters followed. They uncovered evidence of financial crimes. Now, the police are investigating those crimes. Melanie's name was in the evidence they found." I picked up the top article and held it out to my father. "Read it. It's all here." He stared at the paper as if it were a snake. My mother just shook her head, sobbing. "You put them onto her. You leaked this." "It wasn't me," I said, and the lie was so close to the truth that it felt like righteousness. It was the system, a system of consequences. It's the same system that allows me to have this job and this apartment. It's a system that says actions have results. Melanie's actions produce these results. My father looked at me, his eyes searching for the hysterical, emotional daughter he knew how to fight. He couldn't find her. He was faced with a calm, rational stranger. His anger, with no emotional fuel to sustain it, sputtered and died, leaving behind only a haggard, defeated emptiness. He looked old. They left without another word. I watched them go. Two broken people who had built their world on a foundation of lies and were now watching it crumble. When the door closed behind them, I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. Later that evening, I picked up the evening paper from the lobby. There she was, on the front of the business section. It was an old photo, one of her smiling, professionally shot social media pictures, looking bright and full of promise. It was placed next to a stark, brutal headline, "Local influencer and entrepreneur under investigation in widening corporate fraud case." I stared at her smiling face. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph, a cathartic release, but I didn't. There was no joy in this. There was only quiet, a deep, profound, and all-encompassing silence. The screaming in my head had finally stopped. The phone call came a week after their disastrous visit. The initial shockwave of the investigation had passed, replaced by the grim, grinding reality of legal proceedings. I was at my desk, finalizing a report, when my mother's number appeared. I almost let it go to voicemail, but a cold curiosity made me answer. I put the call on speakerphone, set the phone on the desk, and continued working as she began to speak. Claire. Her voice was thin, brittle, like a dead leaf. All the weeping was gone, burned away, leaving behind only the dry husk of resentment. "I'm here," I said, my eyes still on the spreadsheet in front of me. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her shaky breathing. "I have one question for you," she said, her voice low and venomous. "Does this make you feel better, seeing her suffer, watching us fall apart? Does it give you some kind of sick satisfaction?" I stopped typing. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the phone as if it were a strange specimen under glass. She was still trying to make it about my feelings, my jealousy. She was incapable of seeing the situation for what it was, a simple, brutal equation of action and consequence. "This has nothing to do with how I feel." "Mom," I replied, my voice calm and measured, "I'm not the district attorney. I'm not the bank. I'm not the press. I just let the truth do its job." A sound that was half sob, half scoff, came through the speaker. "The truth. You wouldn't know the truth if it stood up and slapped you. The truth is, you've been jealous of your sister since the day she was born. The accusation was her oldest, most trusted weapon, the one she unsheathed whenever my achievements made Melanie's failures look too stark. You had the grades, the career, but she had the charm. She had a light in her that people loved, and you couldn't stand it. You always wanted to see that light go out." For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel the sting of that accusation. I didn't feel the need to defend myself, to list my accomplishments, to argue that I had a life of my own, because in that moment, I saw her argument for the pathetic, desperate lie it was. A small, cold laugh escaped my lips. "Jealous," I said, and the sound of my own mirth seemed to startle her into silence. "No, Mom, I was never jealous of Melanie." I took a breath, and the words that came next were the truest I had ever spoken. I was just a kid who learned, very early on, how to live without being chosen. The line went dead with silence. I had given her a truth so fundamental, so far outside the script of our family drama, that she had no response. She couldn't process it. To her, there were only two roles: the beloved child and the jealous one. The idea of a third option, a child who had simply accepted her irrelevance and built a life in spite of it, was an alien concept. I imagined her on the other end, phone pressed to her ear, adrift in an ocean of cognitive dissonance. I also heard something else in the background of that silence. Before she hung up without another word, I heard my father's voice, a low, indistinct murmur. But he wasn't shouting. He wasn't defending her or Melanie. He was just there, a silent witness. It was a new role for him, and in his silence, I understood that he was finally, irrevocably broken. The narrative he had built his life around, the successful patriarch, protecting his precious, delicate daughter from her cold, ambitious sibling, had been obliterated by a stack of legal documents. There was nothing left for him to say. The news came through formal channels a few weeks later. Melanie Dalton had been officially indicted by a grand jury on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Her lawyer, a cut-rate public defender my parents were struggling to pay for, was quoted in the paper saying that a conviction was likely. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence. The charming, unlucky angel was now a federal defendant. I felt a morbid pull, a need to see the final scene. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself driving through the familiar tree-lined streets of Fairview Heights. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my car seemed to know the way. My hands guiding the wheel on autopilot, I turned onto the street I grew up on, and when my parents' house came into view, I slowed the car to a stop. It looked smaller, shabbier than I remembered. The lawn, once my father's pride and joy, was overgrown in patches. But that wasn't what held my gaze. Staked into the center of the lawn was a sign, a bright red and white sign with a single, brutal word for sale. They were selling the house, the repository of all our family myths, the stage for every birthday and holiday, the backdrop of my entire childhood, was being liquidated. They were selling their past to pay for Melanie's future, a future that would likely be spent in a courtroom and possibly a prison. The symbolism was so heavy, so absolute, it felt like the final page of a book slamming shut. As I sat there, staring, the front door opened. My mother stepped out onto the porch. She was holding a watering can, but she wasn't watering the wilting geraniums in their pots. She was just standing there, looking at the sign. She seemed to shrink into the landscape, a small gray figure against the backdrop of their ruined life. Then, she turned her head and saw my car. We looked at each other across the expanse of the overgrown lawn. There was no wave, no flicker of recognition that I was her daughter. Her eyes were as flat and empty as a winter sky. She just watched me for a long, silent moment. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. Slowly, she took a few steps to the edge of the porch, her movements stiff and aged. She didn't raise her voice. The words floated across the lawn, quiet and devastatingly final. "You don't need to come back anymore, Claire." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a formal declaration of my exile. She was banishing a ghost that had already departed. I put the car in drive. I didn't look at her again. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead and drove away. I drove past the manicured lawns and the identical mailboxes, leaving the quiet, respectable drama of Fairview Heights behind me for the last time. As my car turned off that familiar street, a profound realization settled over me. It wasn't a feeling of sadness or loss. It was a feeling of immense, terrifying clarity. They hadn't banished me. They had just finally acknowledged that I was gone. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't lost them. They had lost me, and it was a loss from which they would never, ever recover. The call came from Mr. Harrison's assistant. The request was for my immediate presence in conference room 4, and the tone was one of quiet urgency. This was not a standard meeting. When I walked in, I understood why. Mr. Harrison was there, looking unusually grim, and with him were two men in plain, ill-fitting suits. They had the unmistakable air of law enforcement, a quiet, patient authority that made the corporate sleekness of the room feel like a fragile stage set. "Claire, thank you for coming," Mr. Harrison said, gesturing to a chair. "This is Detective Miller and Detective Sanchez. They have some questions regarding the Marvin Media audit." I sat, placing my hands on the cool surface of the mahogany table. I met the detective's eyes, my expression one of professional curiosity. "Of course. How can I help?" Detective Miller, the older of the two, leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Dalton, we are in possession of information, originating from an anonymous source, that alleges significant financial crimes were committed by employees at Marvin Media. Your firm's internal investigation, which we understand you are leading, was launched around the same time. We believe your preliminary findings might be of great interest to us." The moment was here, the culmination of my silent, methodical work. The air was taut, stretched thin like a piano wire. They were looking at me, expecting a corporate employee, perhaps a little nervous, a little intimidated. They did not know they were talking to the architect of the very situation they were investigating. "I'm bound by a certain level of corporate confidentiality," I began, choosing my words with the precision of a surgeon. "However, given that this is now a formal criminal investigation, I believe my duty is to cooperate fully. In the course of my audit, I did uncover a series of highly irregular transactions and what I believe to be a coordinated effort to defraud the company. I didn't offer details. I didn't mention names. I spoke purely in the language of my profession of ledgers, invoices, and procedural anomalies. I was not a witness. I was a data source. We would need to see that data." "Ms. Dalton," Detective Sanchez said, his voice flat, "all of it." "I understand," I replied. I anticipated this might be a possibility. I took the liberty of compiling all relevant documents into a single, comprehensive file. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the small, black USB drive. It felt impossibly small in my palm, a tiny vessel for so much ruin. I slid it across the polished table. It came to a stop directly in front of Detective Miller. He picked it up. "Is it protected?" "Yes," I said. "The password is a 6-digit numerical code. May I?" He nodded. I leaned forward and wrote on a small notepad, 0512. I pushed it towards him. I watched as his eyes glanced down at the numbers, meaningless to him, and then back at my face. He saw nothing. He saw a competent project manager doing her job. He did not see a daughter using the date of her mother's birth to unlock the evidence that would condemn her sister. The meeting concluded shortly after. They had what they needed. As I walked back to my office, the tension in the air seemed to have dissipated. I had passed the point of no return long ago. This was merely the final, formal transfer of power. The ledger was no longer mine. It now belonged to the state. The press, fed by official leaks from the prosecutor's office, erupted. The story was no longer about a vague corporate scandal. It was now about a specific person, Melanie Dalton, local influencer, indicted in 6-figure money laundering scheme. Her name and face were everywhere, yet my name appeared nowhere. The source of the investigation was always referred to as evidence uncovered during a routine corporate audit. I was a ghost, my actions invisible, my existence irrelevant to the public narrative. I had set a fire and vanished, leaving only the flames behind. I followed the news of my family's collapse with the detached interest of a day trader watching a stock plummet. I read online that the Fairview Heights house had been sold in a private, off-market deal to cover the first wave of legal fees. They had traded their entire history for the slim chance of mitigating Melanie's future. I waited for the feeling of elation, the savage, triumphant joy I had read about in stories of revenge. I imagined I would feel a hot surge of vindication, a sense of righteous satisfaction. But it never came. Instead, as I sat alone in my quiet apartment, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city, the only thing I felt was lightness. It wasn't the lightness of happiness. It was the lightness of an immense, lifelong weight being lifted from my shoulders, the pressure to compete, the struggle for a scrap of approval, the constant, grinding ache of being second best. It was all gone. The game board had been cleared. The pieces had been swept away. I was no longer a player in their drama because the drama itself had ceased to exist. I was just me. The feeling was so vast and so new. It was almost disorienting. One evening, a message popped up on my phone. It was from a senior colleague, a sharp analyst named David who had been on the restructuring team. Heard the DA used your audit data as the cornerstone of their case. Must have been one hell of an audit. I'm guessing you knew more than you let on in those meetings. I looked at the message, a small test of my composure. He was fishing, but respectfully. He sensed the outline of the ghost in the machine. My reply was swift, concise, and utterly true. I just balance ledgers. David, it's what I do, personal and professional. I added a winking emoji and left it at that. He replied a moment later with a simple, understood. That night, the reckoning reached its visual climax. I was pouring myself a glass of wine when her face appeared on the local news. It wasn't a file photo this time. It was video footage. Melanie, dressed in a ridiculously inappropriate white blazer, was being led out of the courthouse. Her wrists were bound in front of her by a pair of gleaming steel handcuffs. She looked pale and terrified, a shadow of the vibrant, confident woman who had smirked at me over a slice of cheesecake. But even then, even in the depths of her public humiliation, the old instincts kicked in. As the camera flashes erupted around her, she tried to smile. It was a grotesque, fractured thing, a desperate twitch of her lips, an attempt to perform her way out of a reality that could no longer be manipulated by charm. She was still playing to the audience, even as the curtain fell on her life. I raised the remote and pressed the mute button. The sound of the reporters shouting questions vanished, leaving only the silent, pathetic image of her on the screen. I didn't want to hear the commentary. I didn't want to hear the analysis. The visual was enough. I took a sip of my wine, the deep red liquid cool and smooth. I watched her cuffed hands, her ruined face, her tragic little smile. The weight I had felt lift from me earlier was now a settled state. It was a profound and absolute quiet. The constant, buzzing frequency of resentment that had been the background noise of my entire life had finally been switched off. Everything was still. For the first time, it was truly, completely, peacefully silent. 2 months passed. For my family, it was a period of frantic, costly legal maneuvers and public disgrace. For me, it was a time of unprecedented peace. The quiet in my head was a new and welcome companion. I excelled at work, took on new projects, and slept through the night for the first time in years. The background noise of my life had been muted, and in the silence, I was thriving. Then, a text message disrupted the calm. It was from my mother. "Can we meet, please? The Corner Perk Cafe. Tomorrow at 2. The Corner Perk. It was a place heavy with ghosts. A quaint little coffee shop where she used to take me for hot chocolate after I'd won a spelling bee or aced a piano recital. It was a place from the time before Melanie's light had grown so bright it had cast me permanently into shadow. Her choice of venue was a deliberate, clumsy attempt at emotional archaeology, trying to dig up a version of us that had been buried for decades. I knew I should refuse, but a part of me needed to see the final act through. I simply replied, "Fine." I arrived exactly at 2. The cafe was the same, with its worn wooden tables and the familiar smell of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. I saw her in a booth by the window, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman who had always been so meticulously put together, so conscious of appearances, was gone. In her place was a stranger who looked frail and exhausted. Her hair was uncolored, showing a stark line of gray at the roots. She wore no makeup, and her face, stripped of its usual mask of pleasantries, was a roadmap of grief and anxiety. She had aged 10 years in 2 months. I slid into the booth opposite her. She flinched, as if my presence were a sudden, cold draft. A waitress came, and I ordered a black coffee. My mother just shook her head, staring at the scarred surface of the table. We sat in a thick, suffocating silence until my coffee arrived. I took a sip, the bitter heat a grounding sensation. I would not speak first. This was her meeting, her final, desperate gambit. Finally, she looked up, her eyes dull and empty. "We lost everything," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "The house, the savings, our reputation. Your father. He doesn't even talk anymore. He just sits in that awful little apartment we're renting and stares at the walls." She paused, her gaze fixing on my face, a flicker of the old resentment returning. "And you sit there, looking perfect, calm. How can you be so calm through all of this?" I placed my cup down in its saucer with a soft, deliberate click. "Because I lost you all a long time ago," I said. There was no anger in my voice, no satisfaction. It was a simple statement of fact, an entry I had logged in my emotional ledger years ago. This is just the paperwork catching up." Her face crumpled, the accusation of my calmness being more than she could bear. "It was you, wasn't it? The police, the reporters. It all started with your company. You did this to us, to your own sister." "Melanie did this to Melanie," I corrected her, my voice remaining level. "She signed the papers. She took the money. I simply allowed the system she tried to cheat to do its job, a system of consequences." She shook her head, a gesture of profound denial. Her hand fumbled in her purse and pulled out a thick, wrinkled envelope. She pushed it across the table towards me. It was a plain, white business envelope, bulging with cash. "What is this?" I asked. "It's what's left," she said, her voice cracking. "From the house, after the lawyers took their share. It's not much, but you should have it. You take it. Claire." I stared at the envelope. It was the most pathetic, most insulting gesture of her life. Was it a bribe for my silence? An attempt at an apology? Or was it one last, desperate effort to cast herself in the role of the provider, the mother taking care of her child? She was offering me the ashes of their life, expecting me to be grateful. I placed my palm flat on the envelope and slowly pushed it back across the table to her side. "I don't need it," I said. "I can take care of myself." I let a beat of silence pass, then added the final, killing blow. As always. Her hand recoiled from the envelope as if it were hot, and then something in her expression shifted. The anger, the resentment, the self-pity, it all seemed to fall away, leaving behind a raw, stunned look of clarity. She was looking at me, truly looking at me, perhaps for the very first time. It was as if the caricature of the cold, jealous daughter she had carried in her mind for 30 years had just dissolved, revealing the stranger sitting in front of her. "You know," she said, her voice barely audible, filled with a strange, mournful wonder, "all you ever wanted was for us to be proud of you." It was the closest she would ever come to an apology, to acknowledging the lifetime of neglect. A younger version of me would have wept at those words, would have collapsed under the weight of that belated, partial recognition, but that version of me was long gone. "I used to," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I used to want that more than anything." I met her gaze, holding it, refusing to let her look away, but I grew out of it, and for the last 10 years, I would have settled for you simply not despising me. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. There was nothing left to say. She finally broke eye contact, looking down at her trembling hands. Slowly, as if her bones ached, she slid out of the booth. She didn't say goodbye. She just turned and walked away, a stooped, defeated figure who disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. I sat there for a long time after she was gone, finishing my coffee. I felt nothing, no pity, no anger, no lingering sadness, just the quiet, clean emptiness of a transaction that was finally complete. I paid the bill and left. As I walked down the street, I took my phone out of my pocket. I opened the photo gallery. I scrolled past the pictures of friends, of landscapes, of my own life, until I reached the album titled Family. My finger hovered over the screen. There they were, all of them, Christmas mornings and birthday parties, Melanie, beaming in her dance costume, my father, carving a turkey, my mother, smiling her tight, polite smile, a lifetime of carefully staged happiness, a portfolio of lies. Methodically, I began to delete them, one by one. The photo of us at the Grand Canyon, the awkward family portrait from a decade ago, the snapshot of Melanie and me as children. Her arm slung possessively around my shoulder. I swiped and tapped, my movements precise and efficient. With each deletion, I felt another cord being cut, another anchor being weighed. When I was done, the album was empty. I put the phone back in my pocket. I did not cry. There were no tears left for that life. There was only the feeling of stepping out from a great and heavy shadow, of finally being free. It was not joy. It was something deeper, quieter, and more profound. It was liberation. A few evenings in the later part of autumn, I found myself walking. There was no destination, only a desire for the crisp, cold air and the rhythmic sound of my own footsteps on the pavement. The city had surrendered to the night, a tapestry of distant sirens and the hum of traffic. My feet, moving with a memory of their own, led me through unfamiliar neighborhoods that slowly, inevitably, began to feel familiar. And then, I was there, on her street. I stopped at the corner, the old muscle memory of my childhood caution still intact. The streetlights cast long, lonely pools of orange onto the asphalt. The houses were all the same dark, quiet, their windows like sleeping eyes, all except for one. The house I grew up in. It was no longer dark. Light poured from every window, a warm, buttery glow that seemed alien and intrusive. A large moving truck was parked at the curb. Its ramp extended to the open front door like a thirsty tongue, and there, Staked into the middle of the lawn was a sign. The bright red banner across the top didn't say for sale anymore. It said, sold. The transaction was complete. The past had been liquidated. I watched for a long time. A ghost on the sidewalk. I could see the silhouettes of people moving inside a man lifting a box. A woman directing him. The small, quick shape of a child chasing a ball through what used to be the living room. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of their laughter. They were a new family, planting the seeds of their own history in the soil of my family's ruin. They were painting over the watermarks of old tears and arguments with the bright, clean colors of their own future. I thought I would feel a pang of loss, a ghost of nostalgia. I expected to feel the sting of being an outsider looking in at a life that was once mine, but I felt nothing. The house was no longer a place of pain or memory. It was just an asset that had been sold, a property, a collection of wood and glass and brick. It held no power over me anymore. A small, quiet smile touched my lips, a private acknowledgement that only I would understand. I looked at the warm, happy light spilling from the windows, at the silhouettes of the new family starting their life, and I whispered the words into the cold night air. They got their wish. I turned and walked back to my car. My footsteps steady and even. The air in the car was cool and smelled of leather. It was my space, a space I had earned. I started the engine and the radio came on softly, tuned to a news station. I was about to change it when a familiar name caught my ear. And in local court news, Melanie Dalton, the social media influencer at the center of the Marvin media fraud case, has avoided jail time today. The newscaster's voice was bland, professional, in a plea agreement. Ms. Dalton was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. The judge cited her cooperation with the prosecution in their ongoing case against her ex-boyfriend, financial broker Julian Croft. Her defense attorney stated that Ms. Dalton was a victim, manipulated by a sophisticated criminal. I listened to the words, the carefully spun narrative of her victimhood, the legal maneuvering that had reduced her crimes to a slap on the wrist. I waited for the anger, for the familiar, hot surge of injustice. I waited to feel the rage that she was, once again, getting away with it, that her charm and pathetic helplessness had won her a reprieve from true consequences. Nothing. I felt absolutely nothing. The verdict was irrelevant. Her sentence, her future, her pathetic attempts to rebrand herself as a victim, none of it mattered. It was like reading the stock market report for a company I had sold my shares in years ago. The outcome had no bearing on my portfolio. My goal had never been her incarceration. My goal was the dissolution of the rotten, bankrupt entity that was our family. The books were closed. The final accounts had been reconciled. Her fate was just a postscript, a footnote in a story that was already over. I had balanced my ledger. My phone buzzed in the center console, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Mr. Harrison, the CFO. Congratulations on your promotion. Director Dalton, well deserved. The board was unanimous. Director Dalton. The name felt solid, real, an identity I had forged for myself, built on competence and merit, not on charm or pity. It was a title I had earned in a world of clean lines, of profit and loss, of accountability. I tapped the power button and the phone's screen went black. In the dark, reflective surface, I saw my own face, illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. My expression was calm, serene. There were no traces of the angry, wounded girl who had cried in her car. There were no remnants of the daughter who had starved for a word of praise. That person was gone, a casualty of a war that had finally ended. I no longer needed to prove anything. I no longer needed their approval, their recognition, or even their resentment. They were a closed account, a bad debt written off. I no longer needed them at all. They wished she was their only child. Now, she is. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support this work, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.